children are egocentric. And what that means is, it doesn't mean that they're selfish. They are self-centered because they have to be. Children can be rough with the dog, rough with the family pet, because they don't realize a family pet might feel uncomfortable. You can see some group cruelty with kids, all kinds of behaviors that don't look very pretty. And so one of the things is to be able to realize that children develop their morals as they go through their, childhood, and I talked about that a bit earlier. But you're not going to see this high level of consideration. The kids who are very, very sensitive and very, very considerate of others are often struggling with anxiety because it's almost like they take in too much of other people's feelings. So it's actually very healthy to be egocentric because they have to develop a healthy self. If kids are over-concerned with other people, it takes away from developing a healthy self. Kids who had to be their parents' caretaker, for example, were deprived of having a healthy childhood where they could be a bit self-centered. Yeah. And that means that they don't understand the effect that their behavior has on you. And even when they're 17, they don't fully get it because they're still allergic to you and your needs. So they're not really tuned into how their behavior affects you or how you're doing. Imagine if your 8-year-old looked at you and said, Mom, Dad, you've done so much today. You worked, you picked me up from school, now you're making dinner. How are you? Why don't you sit down and I'll make you some tea? That would be a problem. It really would. And And so it's one of those things we have to come to terms with. Now here's a piece. Children hang out with other kids. So when they're at school, they're hanging out with other egocentric people, which means they're not always going to be that nice to each other. And so, that's kind of the way it is. When they come home and complain about that, you can give them empathy, you can listen, and that kind of thing. But it is one of the givens of life, isn't it? That people will not always be loving and kind, especially your peers. Now, I know we've got some programs in place, some of them to do with bullying, and some of them to do with just normal schoolyard politics. And I'm not sure that those programs always work that well. My Cut It Out article, I think in October, Island Parent, is about growling and snarling. I think that kids need permission to growl and snarl. As a matter of fact, when kids are upset, sometimes when they're young, they growl. That's what they do. They just stand there and growl. And I think, what's wrong with growling? I think it would be good for all of us to growl when we get upset, especially with our partners. Just stand there and growl instead of all those stupid things that could come out of your mouth. But if you look at animals, and I thought about this a few weeks ago when I was walking a dog, and I noticed that this dog was growling, when another dog came along. This dog had balls. And so, our dog was growling, and I thought, well, that doesn't mean that our dog's aggressive. Our dog is just giving a warning. If our dog bit the other dog, then that would be a sign of aggression. But I think that kids should be allowed to give a little bit of a warning. They should learn to be able to say, hey, quit pulling my hat or my sweater. And they should be allowed to say it like they mean it. Learning how to growl means learning how to say something assertively without putting the other person down, but being able to have strong enough body language so that they can kind of be in charge of their space. It's not about being aggressive, and it's not about being passive. It's about being able to say, hey, that's not okay. When I used to work with kids, if they were having a tough time socially or with bullying and that kind of thing, I used to ask them to show me how they look when they feel comfortable and confident. And then I would mirror their body language, and we would practice snappy comebacks that they could use in the schoolyard. Just things that they could say that might be funny or might be very assertive. And if kids can learn to do this kind of thing, often the kids who lash out and hit because they're overwhelmed, they will stop hitting because you're actually giving them a stance and language that they can use. So what I'm saying here is often kids resort to hitting and aggression because they simply don't know what else to do. And if you have a few scripted responses, then when it comes to being in the heat of the moment, they will be able to refer to that scripted response. Does that make sense?